The year was 1882, a time when secrets could destroy reputations, when widows were expected to remain in mourning forever, when a woman's past defined her future. This is the story of Elizabeth Walker, a Chicago schoolteacher whose hidden history became her greatest obstacle in the untamed Wyoming territory, until she met the one man who understood that broken hearts could heal stronger than before. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elizabeth Walker's trembling fingers gripped the worn handle of her carpet bag as the stagecoach rolled to a stop. Through the dust-streaked window, the settlement of Willow Springs appeared, a cluster of wooden buildings huddled against the vast Wyoming prairie, nothing like the towering brick structures of Chicago she had left behind. Last stop, Willow. "Springs!" the driver bellowed, his voice hoarse from years of competing with the wind. Elizabeth gathered her strength, smoothing the black crepe armband hidden beneath her sleeve, a small reminder of the life she was leaving behind. 6 months of travel had left her grey traveling suit wrinkled, her body weary from the endless jolting, but she maintained her posture as she descended from the coach. The Wyoming air was different, crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and distant pine. Her gaze swept across the dusty main street, searching for the face that matched the photograph she'd received 4 months prior. Thomas Bennett had described himself as a prosperous merchant, seeking a wife of good character and domestic ability. Their exchange of letters over 8 months had led to this moment, her arrival to become his bride. Mrs. Walker? Elizabeth's heart stopped. The formal address. He knew. She turned slowly toward the voice, dread pooling in her stomach. A portly man with meticulously waxed mustaches approached, his fine wool suit marking him as someone of means in this frontier town. His eyes, however, held none of the warmth she had imagined when reading his letters. They were cold, calculating, already dismissing her. "Mr. Bennett," she managed, attempting a small curtsy that felt desperately out of place as several townspeople paused to watch. "Indeed." His gaze raked over her, lingering on the slight wear at her cuffs, the practical nature of her boots. His frown deepened. "You're not what I expected." Elizabeth's throat tightened. "I assure you, sir, I'm the same woman who wrote those letters. Perhaps the journey has—" "It's not your appearance," he interrupted, taking a deliberate step back. "Though you are older than your letters suggested." The word stung. At 28, she knew she was past the ideal age for marriage, but she had been honest about her years. "I don't understand," she said, struggling to maintain her composure. "We discussed my background. I mentioned my teaching experience. You mentioned teaching." His voice hardened, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "You failed to mention you'd been married before, that you're a widow." Gasps rippled through the onlookers. A woman nearby clutched her companion's arm, whispering. Behind her gloved hand, Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. I thought it best to explain in person. My husband died 3 years ago. The war... You deliberately concealed vital information." Thomas's voice rose with righteous indignation. "I advertised for a maiden of good character, not someone with a past. Widowhood is hardly a character flaw," Elizabeth protested, her voice barely above a whisper. "For my purposes, it is," Thomas declared. "I need a wife above reproach to help establish my business reputation. The bank trustees expect certain standards." The gathering crowd pressed closer, their murmurs growing louder. Elizabeth caught fragments of their conversation. Poor thing, trying to pass herself off as something she's not. Bennett's right to be angry. Who knows what other secrets she's hiding? Thomas reached into his vest pocket, withdrawing a small leather purse. "I'm not without compassion. This should cover your return journey east. The next stage leaves in 2 days." He thrust the purse toward her. the coins inside clinking like a death knell for her hopes. And where am I to stay until then? Elizabeth asked, not touching the offered money, her pride the only thing keeping her upright. Something flickered across Thomas's face, perhaps a moment of conscience. "The Frontier Hotel has rooms. Tell Mrs. Crawford I sent you." He hesitated, then added stiffly, "I am sorry for the misunderstanding." With that, he turned away, leaving Elizabeth standing alone with her carpet-bag, the curious stares of strangers, and the crushing realization that she had nowhere to go. The journey had consumed most of her savings. Chicago held nothing for her, her teaching position filled, her small apartment surrendered, her few friends scattered to their own lives. With as much dignity as she could muster, Elizabeth picked up her belongings and walked toward the weathered sign of the Frontier Hotel, ignoring the whispers that followed her. Deceived him, she did. What did she expect, hiding something like that? No decent man wants damaged goods. The hotel proprietress, Mrs. Crawford, was a thin woman with sharp eyes that softened slightly at Elizabeth's predicament. "Just 2 nights?" she asked, sliding a brass key across the scarred wooden counter. "That's all Bennett paid for." "Yes," Elizabeth replied, placing her last few coins beside the key. "I'll be moving on." "That's what they all say, dear," Mrs. Crawford said, not unkindly. "Rooms at the end of the hall. Supper's at 6 if you're hungry." The room was sparse, an iron bedstead, a washstand with a chipped pitcher, and a single window overlooking the alley behind the hotel. Elizabeth set down her carpet-bag and finally allowed her shoulders to slump. 8 months of correspondence, of building hope, of imagining a new life, all destroyed in less than 10 minutes of conversation. She removed her gloves slowly, revealing hands that bore the faint mark where her wedding ring had once rested. The hands that had nursed her husband through his final days after he returned from the war, broken in body and spirit. The hands that had supported herself through 3 years of widowhood, teaching other people's children while longing for her own. From her carpet-bag, she withdrew a small, leather-bound Bible, her mother's, and pressed it to her chest. "What now?" she whispered to the empty room. The next stage east would take her where? Not Chicago, perhaps St. Louis, where her cousin lived, though they hadn't corresponded in years. Each option seemed as insubstantial as morning mist, as evening descended on Willow Springs. Elizabeth sat by the window, watching the town transform in the fading light. Oil lamps flickered to life, casting yellow pools on the boardwalk. The sounds of the saloon down the street grew louder. Laughter, the clinking of glasses, someone playing a fiddle. A soft knock at her door interrupted her melancholy thoughts. "Mrs. Walker?" Mrs. Crawford called. "You have a visitor in the dining room. Says it's important." Elizabeth stiffened. Another curious townsperson, someone offering unwanted pity. Or worse, did he give a name, she asked, approaching the door warily. "Matthew Carson, owns the Double C Ranch north of town. Respectable enough, though folks say he's got his own sorrows." Elizabeth hesitated, meeting strange men in Frontier. Hotels went against every propriety she'd been raised with. Yet propriety had already failed her spectacularly today. "Please, tell Mr. Carson I'll be down momentarily." She quickly tidied her appearance, pinning loose strands of dark hair and straightening her collar. Whatever this meeting entailed, she would face it with dignity. The dining room was nearly empty, most guests having finished their supper. A man rose from a corner table as she entered, and Elizabeth's first impression was of quiet strength. Matthew Carson was tall and lean, his face weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes, deep brown and startlingly gentle, held a sadness that seemed to recognize her own. Unlike Thomas Bennett's ostentatious display of wealth, Carson's clothes were simple but well made, his boots showing honest wear. There was something in his bearing that spoke of hard-earned wisdom rather than inherited privilege. "Mrs. Walker," he said, his voice low and respectful. Thank you for seeing me. May I offer you some coffee? As Elizabeth sat across from this stranger, she couldn't know that this unexpected meeting would change everything, that this quiet rancher carried his own scars from loss, that he understood the courage it took to seek a second chance at happiness, that he would see beyond her past to the woman she truly was. She only knew that for the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, someone was looking at her without judgment or pity. "Mr. Carson," she acknowledged cautiously, "I'm told you wish to speak with me about an important matter." "I heard what happened with Bennett," Matthew said, signaling to the waitress for 2 cups of coffee. "News travels fast in small towns." Elizabeth straightened her spine. "I'm sure the entire settlement is thoroughly entertained by my situation." A flicker of understanding crossed Matthew's weathered features. Some folks find comfort in others' misfortunes, makes them feel superior, but that's not why I'm here. The waitress set down 2 steaming mugs. Matthew nodded his thanks before continuing. "I manage the Double C Ranch about 10 miles north of town. It's a cattle operation primarily, but—" He hesitated, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I find myself in need of help, though perhaps not the kind most ranches require." Elizabeth wrapped her fingers around the warm mug, skepticism evident in her raised eyebrow. "What sort of help could I possibly provide, Mr. Carson? As was made abundantly clear today, my past makes me unsuitable for conventional positions." "That depends on how you define conventional," Matthew replied. "I have a situation that requires someone with experience in loss, in starting over, someone who understands that life doesn't always follow the path we plan." Elizabeth studied him carefully. His hands were those of a working man, calloused and strong, yet he held his coffee cup with unexpected gentleness. There was something in his manner that didn't quite align with the typical frontier rancher. "You speak in riddles, Mr. Carson. Perhaps you should explain plainly what you're offering." Matthew leaned forward slightly. "I have 2 children, Mrs. Walker. Sarah is 9 and James is 7. They lost their mother 2 years ago to pneumonia. Since then—" His voice caught slightly. "Since then, they've had a series of housekeepers and temporary caretakers. None stayed long. The children need more than just someone to cook and clean. They need someone who understands grief, who can help them navigate loss while still believing in the possibility of happiness." The revelation shifted something in Elizabeth's understanding. This wasn't just a job offer. It was a plea from one wounded soul to another. "You're offering me a position as a governess?" she asked, surprise coloring her voice. "In a manner of speaking. More than that, really. The children need education, yes, but they also need healing. As do I, if I'm being honest." Matthew's gaze met hers directly. "Your situation with Bennett, your widowhood, it's not a liability to me, it's a qualification. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." The offer hung in the air between them, as tangible as the steam rising from their coffee cups. Elizabeth searched Matthew's face for any sign of ulterior motive, but found only earnest sincerity mixed with a vulnerability that mirrored her own. "Why me?" she asked finally. "Surely there are women in town who could provide what your children need, women without complications." Matthew's mouth curved in a rueful half-smile. "Every widow in Willow Springs has tried to catch my eye since Margaret passed. They see the ranch, the stability it represents, but none of them look at my children with understanding. They see 2 obstacles to overcome, not souls to nurture. And you believe I would be different. When Bennett denounced you in the street, you didn't crumble. You didn't beg or make excuses. You stood there with dignity, even as your world fell apart." Matthew's voice softened. "That's the kind of strength my children need to see. The kind that comes from surviving loss, not avoiding it." Elizabeth took a slow sip of coffee, considering. The position offered escape from her immediate predicament, but more than that, it offered purpose, something she'd been searching for since her husband's death. "I would need to know more about your expectations," she said carefully. "And I would want to meet the children before agreeing to anything." Relief flickered across Matthew's features. "Of course. I wouldn't have it any other way. I'm in town for supplies today. We could ride out to the ranch tomorrow if you're willing. And if it doesn't suit, if I prove unsuitable, then I'll personally ensure you reach wherever you choose. To go next, Denver, St. Louis, wherever you wish, with enough funds to establish yourself properly." It was a generous offer, far more than Thomas Bennett's grudging handful of coins. Elizabeth studied Matthew's weathered hands, noting the careful way he held his cup, the patient stillness in his posture. Here was a man who understood waiting, who knew that trust had to be earned, not demanded. "Very well, Mr. Carson. I'll visit your ranch tomorrow." The next morning dawned clear and cold, frost glittering on the boardwalk as Elizabeth waited outside the hotel. She'd spent a restless night weighing her options, but something about Matthew Carson's quiet honesty had decided her. If nothing else, she would see this through. Matthew arrived promptly at 8 with a sturdy wagon already loaded with supplies. He helped her up to the seat with a respectful distance that Elizabeth appreciated, then clicked to the horses. As they left Willow Springs behind, the landscape opened before them, endless prairie giving way to rolling hills dotted with pine. The morning sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber, so different from Chicago's crowded streets and smoke-stained buildings. "It's beautiful," Elizabeth murmured, surprising herself. Matthew nodded. "Margaret used to say the land here had its own kind of poetry, raw but honest." "Tell me about her," Elizabeth said, then immediately regretted the presumption. "If you don't mind, that is." For a long moment, only the creak of wagon wheels and the steady clop of hooves filled the silence. Then Matthew spoke, his voice thoughtful rather than pained. "Margaret was unexpected. A school teacher from Boston who answered my advertisement. For a mail-order bride 6 years ago. Everyone thought she'd wilt out here, too delicate, too refined for ranch life. But she proved them wrong." A fond smile touched his lips. "She could discuss Shakespeare while churning butter, teach the children Latin between feeding chickens. She made this place more than just a ranch. She made it a home." Elizabeth felt a pang of kinship with this unknown woman. "She sounds remarkable." She was, and she'd be the first to tell me that my children need more than my fumbling attempts at domesticity. Matthew glanced at her. "What about your husband, if you're comfortable sharing?" Elizabeth hadn't spoken of Robert to anyone in months, but something about the open sky and Matthew's understanding presence made the words come easier. Robert was a teacher, like me. We met at a literary society meeting, both of us more interested in books than dancing. She smiled at the memory. When the war came, he felt duty-bound to serve. He survived the battles, but camp fever took him 6 months after he returned. He was never quite the same after what he saw. "The war changed many men," Matthew said quietly. "I served too. Cavalry. Sometimes I think Margaret understood my nightmares better than I did." They rode in companionable silence for a while, both lost in memories that no longer felt quite so isolating when shared. As they crested a hill, Matthew gestured ahead. Double C Ranch. The homestead spread below them, a 2-story house with a wraparound porch, a large barn, several outbuildings, and fenced pastures where cattle grazed peacefully. Smoke curled from the chimney, and Elizabeth could see a vegetable garden to one side of the house, though it looked somewhat neglected. "It's larger than I expected," she admitted. "We run about 500 head of cattle, plus horses. I have 4 ranch hands who handle most of the heavy work." Matthew guided the wagon down the gentle slope. "The house Well, it's been lacking a woman's touch. As they approached, two small figures burst from the front door. A girl with Matthew's dark hair in pigtails, and a younger boy whose sandy curls reminded Elizabeth painfully of children she'd taught in Chicago. "Papa," the girl called, then stopped short at the sight of Elizabeth, caution immediately replacing excitement. Matthew climbed down and lifted both children in a brief embrace before turning to help Elizabeth from the wagon. "Sarah, James, this is Mrs. Walker. She's come to visit us today." Sarah eyed Elizabeth warily. "Are you another housekeeper?" "No," Elizabeth replied gently, crouching to the children's level. "I'm a teacher. Your father thought you might like to show me your home." James stepped forward, curiosity overcoming shyness. "Do you know about dragons?" "James believes every story should have dragons," Matthew explained with fond exasperation. "Well," Elizabeth said seriously, "I know quite a few dragon stories. Perhaps we could trade? One of mine for one of yours?" James's face lit up, but Sarah remained reserved. "The last teacher said we were too wild for proper lessons." Then she didn't understand that the best lessons often look like adventures. Elizabeth replied, "Shall we go inside? I'd love to see where you do your studying." The house interior confirmed Matthew's assessment: clean but lacking warmth, functional but missing those small touches that made a house feel lived in. The parlor held good furniture, covered in dust sheets, and the kitchen, while well-equipped, had the sterile feel of a rarely used space. Sarah led her to a small room off the kitchen that served as their schoolroom. Books were stacked haphazardly on shelves, slates lay scattered on a table, and papers covered in childish drawings were pinned to one wall. "Mrs. Henderson quit last month," Sarah explained, her tone carefully neutral. "She said Papa should send us to boarding school." "And what do you think about that?" Elizabeth asked, examining the drawings. Many featured a woman with golden hair, surrounded by flowers. "I won't go," Sarah declared fiercely. "James needs me, and Papa needs us both." Elizabeth recognized the protective instinct of a child forced to grow up too quickly. She'd seen it in students who'd lost parents, that determination to hold together what remained of their family. "Your mother drew flowers like these?" Elizabeth guessed, touching one of the pictures. Sarah's composure cracked slightly. "She had. A garden. Everything died after she got sick. I tried to keep it alive, but I didn't know how." "Gardens are resilient," Elizabeth said softly. "Sometimes they just need the right care to bloom again." The morning passed quickly as Elizabeth assessed the children's education level. Sarah proved advanced in reading, but struggled with mathematics, while James showed artistic talent but little patience for structured lessons. Both were bright, eager to learn when engaged properly, but clearly starved for consistent attention and emotional stability. When Matthew called them for lunch, Elizabeth found he'd prepared a simple but adequate meal, evidence of his efforts to maintain normalcy for his children. They ate in the kitchen, the children gradually warming to Elizabeth's presence as she drew them out with questions about their interests and gentle encouragement. After the meal, while the children cleared dishes, Matthew invited Elizabeth to walk with him. They strolled toward a small fenced area behind the house, the remnants of Margaret's garden. "The children try," Matthew said, gesturing to the withered plants and empty beds, "but neither inherited their mother's green thumb." "Grief affects us all differently," Elizabeth observed. "Sometimes we can't bear to tend the things our loved ones cherished. Sometimes we tend them obsessively. Both are normal." Matthew studied her with those perceptive brown eyes. "You understand more than most." "I've had time to learn." Elizabeth touched a dried rose hip still clinging to a thorny stem. "After Robert died, I couldn't bear to look at his books for months. Then one day, I realized that avoiding them didn't honor his memory. Sharing his love of literature did." "Is that why you became a teacher?" "Partly. and partly because I needed purpose. Grief can consume you if you let it." Matthew nodded slowly. "The ranch keeps me busy, but the children, I worry I'm failing them. Sarah's trying so hard to be strong to mother James, and James retreats further into his imagination every day. They're surviving the only way they know how," Elizabeth said. "What they need isn't just education or domestic care. They need permission to be children again, to grieve and heal at their own pace. Could you give them that?" The question held no pressure, only hope. Elizabeth looked back at the house where young voices carried on the wind, arguing about whose turn it was to dry dishes. She thought of her empty room at the hotel, of the uncertain future that awaited her on the next eastbound stage. Then she thought of Sarah's fierce protectiveness, James's eager questions about dragons, and Matthew's quiet strength in the face of loss. "I could try," she said finally, "but I won't pretend to replace their mother. That's not what any of us need." "No," Matthew agreed. "What we need is someone who understands that hearts can break and mend, that families can be rebuilt, even if they look different than before." He paused, then added, "Room and board plus a fair wage. Your own quarters. There's a small suite attached to the main house with its own entrance, and the freedom to establish whatever routine you think best for the children." Elizabeth considered. The offer. It was generous, respectful, and most importantly, it acknowledged her as a professional rather than a charity case. "There's one more thing," Matthew said hesitantly, "town gossip being what it is." "My reputation is already tarnished," Elizabeth finished for him. "Bennett made sure of that. I was going to say that I don't care about gossip. My children's well-being matters more than wagging tongues. But I want you to know that your position here would be strictly professional, with all the respect that entails." The reassurance, unnecessary but appreciated, decided her. "Then I accept, Mr. Carson. When would you like me to start?" Relief and something deeper, hope perhaps, transformed Matthew's weathered features. "Tomorrow, if you're willing. I can help you collect your things from the hotel this afternoon." As they walked back to the house, Elizabeth felt something shift inside her, not the romantic dreams that had brought her west, but something more solid, more real, a chance to matter again, to use her hard-won understanding of loss to help others navigate their own grief. The children waited on the porch, Sarah's arm protectively around James's shoulders. Their expressions held wariness and hope in equal measure. "Children," Matthew said, "Mrs. Walker has agreed to stay. She'll be helping with your education and, well, helping us all, I think." James stepped forward first. "Will you really teach me about dragons?" "Dragons and mathematics and everything in between," Elizabeth promised. Sarah remained still, studying Elizabeth with eyes too old for her years. "We don't need another mother," she stated flatly. "No, you don't," Elizabeth agreed. "You had a wonderful mother who will always be part of you. What I offer is something different, a friend who understands that missing someone doesn't mean we stop living." Something in Sarah's rigid posture eased slightly. She didn't smile, but she nodded. A small gesture that felt like a beginning. That evening, as Matthew drove Elizabeth back to town to collect her belongings, the setting sun painted the prairie in shades of amber and rose. Tomorrow, she would return to the Double C Ranch, not as a rejected mail-order bride, but as a woman with purpose, bringing her own experience of loss and renewal to a family that needed both. "Thank you," Matthew said quietly as they approached. "Willow Springs, for what? For seeing us, really seeing us, not just a widower and his children, but people trying to find our way forward." Elizabeth thought of Thomas Bennett's cold dismissal, of how her widowhood had been seen as a shameful secret rather than a testament to love and loss survived. "Sometimes," she replied, "it takes someone who's been broken to recognize the cracks in others, and to know that those cracks can let light in if we allow them." As the lights of Willow Springs appeared ahead, Elizabeth realized she wasn't arriving at an ending, but at a beginning she'd never expected, one where her past, instead of disqualifying her, had become the very thing that qualified her for the future now unfolding. The first weeks at the Double C Ranch unfolded like a delicate dance, each person learning the other's rhythms and boundaries. Elizabeth settled into her quarters, a cozy suite with a small sitting room and bedroom, furnished simply but comfortably. Matthew had been true to his word about privacy. Her entrance opened onto the side porch, allowing her to come and go without disturbing the main household. Establishing a routine proved more challenging than Elizabeth had anticipated. Sarah remained guarded, testing boundaries with subtle defiance, while James oscillated between eager attachment and sudden withdrawals into silence. Matthew, for his part, seemed caught between gratitude for her presence and uncertainty about how to navigate this new arrangement. One morning, 3 weeks into her stay, Elizabeth found Sarah alone in the schoolroom, staring at a blank slate. The girl's usual mask of composure had slipped, revealing the vulnerable child beneath. "Mathematics troubling you?" Elizabeth asked gently, settling into a chair nearby. Sarah's shoulders tensed. "Mama used to make it fun. She'd use buttons or dried beans, turn everything into a game." Her voice cracked slightly. "I can't remember how she did it." Elizabeth recognized the pain of fading memories, that desperate fear of losing the small details that kept loved ones alive in our hearts. "Would you like me to show you a game my husband taught me?" Elizabeth offered. "He used it with his students, who struggled with multiplication." Sarah's head snapped up, surprise evident in her brown eyes. "You were married before?" Elizabeth nodded. "Yes. His name was Robert. He died 3 years ago." "Is that why you came west? Because you were sad?" "Partly," Elizabeth admitted, "but also because I hope to find a new purpose. Sometimes, when we lose someone, we need to create something new, not to replace what we've lost, but to honor it by continuing to live fully." Sarah considered this, her small fingers tracing patterns on the slate. "Papa doesn't talk about Mama much. He thinks it upsets us. And does it? Sometimes. But sometimes—" Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "Sometimes I'm afraid I'll forget her if we don't talk about her." Elizabeth reached across the table, not quite touching Sarah's hand, but offering the possibility of comfort. "Then perhaps we should find ways to remember her together. Would you tell me about her garden? I noticed some perennial bulbs that might bloom again with proper care." For the first time since Elizabeth's arrival, Sarah's face brightened with genuine enthusiasm. "Mama loved irises best, purple ones. She said they were like royalty among flowers." The conversation opened a door that had been firmly shut. Over. The next hour, Sarah shared memories of her mother, small, precious details that she'd been hoarding like treasures. Elizabeth listened, understanding that sometimes the greatest gift we can give the grieving is simply the space to remember, aloud. That afternoon, while the children napped, Elizabeth ventured into Margaret's neglected garden. Armed with tools she'd found in the barn, she began clearing weeds and debris, uncovering signs of life beneath the wilderness of neglect. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear Matthew approach until his shadow fell across her. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Elizabeth sat back on her heels, brushing dirt from her hands. "Sarah told me about the irises. I thought perhaps if we could coax them back to life." Matthew crouched beside her, his fingers brushing the earth with unexpected tenderness. "Margaret planted these the first spring after we married. Said every home needed something beautiful that would return year after year, regardless of what else changed." "Wise woman," Elizabeth murmured. "I haven't been able to tend it since she—" Matthew's voice trailed off. It felt like admitting she was really gone. Or perhaps, Elizabeth suggested carefully, tending it felt like trying to hold on to something that had already transformed. Gardens aren't meant to stay the same. They grow, change, adapt to new seasons. Matthew was quiet for a long moment, then began pulling weeds alongside her. They worked in companionable silence until the dinner bell rang, calling them back to the house. That evening, after the children were in bed, Matthew invited Elizabeth to join him on the porch for coffee, a ritual that was becoming comfortably familiar. "Sarah opened up to you today," he observed, passing her a steaming mug. "She's been so closed off since Margaret died. I didn't know how to reach her." "Sometimes it's easier to talk to someone who understands loss from experience," Elizabeth replied. "She's been trying to be strong for you and James. That's a heavy burden for a 9-year-old. Matthew nodded, his gaze fixed on the darkening prairie. "I made mistakes, thought if we just kept moving forward, kept busy enough, the pain would fade." Grief doesn't work that way. It needs to be acknowledged, given space to breathe. "Like a garden," Matthew said softly, understanding dawning in his expression. Their eyes met, and Elizabeth felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced since Robert's death. Not romantic attraction exactly, but a recognition of kindred spirits, of shared understanding that went deeper than mere sympathy. The moment was interrupted by the sound of a horse approaching at speed. A rider materialized from the darkness, his urgent pace suggesting trouble. "Mr. Carson," the man called, reining in his lathered horse. "Sorry to disturb you so late, but there's been trouble in town. Tom Bennett's stirring up something fierce about Mrs. Walker here." Matthew's expression hardened. "What kind of trouble, Jake?" The ranch hand shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Elizabeth. "He's been at the saloon, drinking and talking. Says it ain't proper, a widow living out here. Says he's going to bring it up with the town council, maybe even the territorial marshal." Elizabeth felt her stomach clench. She'd known Bennett's rejection would have consequences, but she'd hoped that settling quietly at the ranch would minimize gossip. "Let him talk," Matthew said firmly. "Mrs. Walker is employed here as governess to my children, with proper accommodations and complete respectability." "Yes, sir, but—" Jake hesitated. "He's got some of the other merchants riled up. Says it's bad for the town's reputation having what he calls loose women taking positions in family homes." The words struck Elizabeth like a physical blow. In 19th century society, a widow who sought employment, especially in a single man's household, was often viewed with suspicion, her very survival needs twisted into something scandalous. Matthew stood abruptly, anger radiating from his typically calm demeanor. "Thank you for the warning, Jake. I'll handle this." After Jake departed, Matthew turned to Elizabeth, his expression troubled. "I'm sorry. I should have anticipated this." "It's not your fault," Elizabeth said quietly, though her hands trembled slightly as she set down her coffee cup. "Mr. Bennett's pride was wounded. He needs someone to blame." "Pride be damned," Matthew muttered. "He has no right to malign your character." "Rights have little to do with gossip," Elizabeth replied with bitter experience. "In Chicago, after Robert died, there were whispers simply because I continued teaching, supporting myself, rather than depending on charity or remarrying immediately." Matthew paced the porch, his agitation palpable. "I won't have you driven away by narrow-minded fools. The children need you. This ranch needs you." The vehemence in his voice surprised them both. He stopped pacing, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "What I mean is," he amended more quietly, "you've brought something back to this house that's been missing. Not just education for the children, but life, purpose." Before Elizabeth could respond, a small voice came from the doorway. "Are you leaving?" James stood there in his nightshirt, his eyes wide with fear. Sarah appeared behind him, her face pale in the lamplight. "We heard voices," Sarah explained, her arm automatically going around her brother's shoulders. James was worried. Elizabeth knelt before them, her heart aching at their obvious distress. "No one's leaving," she said firmly, looking to Matthew for confirmation. "Mrs. Walker is right," Matthew assured them. "Some people in town are saying unkind things, but that doesn't change anything here." "Is it because she was married before?" Sarah asked with startling directness. "Mary Pritchard at church said widows aren't supposed to work in other people's houses." Elizabeth felt Matthew tense beside her, but she addressed Sarah calmly. "Some people have very specific ideas about what widows should or shouldn't do, but I believe that everyone, regardless of their past, should have the right to make an honest living and contribute something meaningful to the world." "Like teaching us," James said, moving closer to Elizabeth. "Exactly like teaching you," she agreed, touching his cheek gently. Sarah studied Elizabeth for a long moment, then surprised everyone by stepping forward and taking her hand. "If you leave, who will help me remember Mama's garden? Who will teach James about dragons and help him with his letters?" The simple questions, asked with such earnest need, crystallized something for Elizabeth. She'd come west, seeking a new beginning, only to face rejection. But here, in this house still haunted by loss, she'd found not just employment, but a purpose that transcended social conventions. "I'm not going anywhere," she promised. "Not unless your father asks me to leave." "That won't happen," Matthew said, quietly, his voice carrying absolute conviction. After settling the children back to bed with extra reassurances, Elizabeth and Matthew returned to the porch. The night had grown cooler, and Matthew draped a shawl around her shoulders with unconscious thoughtfulness. "We need a plan," he said. "Bennett won't let this go easily. His pride's involved now." Elizabeth considered their options. "Perhaps if I attended church this Sunday, faced the gossip directly. Sometimes confronting whispers with dignity can diffuse them." "You shouldn't have to prove anything to anyone," Matthew protested. "No, I shouldn't. But the reality is that we live in a community where perception matters. If I hide away, it only fuels speculation." Matthew nodded reluctantly. "We'll go together. All of us present a united front." The word united hung between them, carrying implications neither was ready to fully explore. Yet Elizabeth felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the shawl around her shoulders. "There's something else," Matthew said after a pause. "The territorial governor is hosting a harvest ball next month in Cheyenne. All the prominent ranchers are expected to attend. It would be an opportunity to establish your position publicly, show that you're here in a professional capacity, properly, chaperoned and respected." Elizabeth's first instinct was to decline. She hadn't attended a social function since Robert's death, but she recognized the strategic value in Matthew's suggestion. Would the children attend as well? Typically no, but Sarah's old enough to be introduced to society, and it might be good for her to see that life contains joy as well as sorrow. The idea of Sarah, so serious and protective, having the chance to simply be a young girl at a dance, swayed Elizabeth's decision. "Then we'll attend," she agreed. "Though I warn you, my dancing skills are somewhat rusty." Matthew's smile transformed his usually solemn features. "Mine as well. Perhaps we should practice to avoid embarrassing ourselves completely." The suggestion was practical, yet it carried an undercurrent of something more, a recognition that their relationship, while professional, was evolving into something neither had anticipated. As they bid each other good night, Elizabeth reflected on how quickly her situation had changed. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a rejected mail-order bride with uncertain prospects. Now she was part of a household, needed and valued, facing challenges that, while daunting, felt purposeful. In her room, she opened her journal, a habit maintained since girlhood, and wrote, "Tonight I promised Sarah and James I wouldn't leave." In that moment, I realized that somewhere between clearing weeds from Margaret's garden and sharing coffee, with Matthew on the porch, I've begun to build something I hadn't dared hope for. Not a replacement for what I've lost, but a new kind of family, formed from shared understanding and mutual need. Tomorrow, we face the town's judgment. But tonight, I feel something I haven't in years. I belong somewhere. The next morning brought an unexpected ally. As Elizabeth helped prepare breakfast, a buggy arrived carrying a well-dressed woman with silver-streaked hair and an air of quiet authority. Mrs. Adeline Parker, Matthew explained as he went to greet her. She owns the largest millinery shop in the territory and sits on the church board. Her opinion carries weight in Willow Springs. Elizabeth watched through the window as Matthew helped Mrs. Parker from her buggy. Their conversation appeared cordial but serious, and Elizabeth braced herself for another confrontation. Instead, Mrs. Parker swept into the kitchen with purposeful energy, extending her hand to Elizabeth without hesitation. "Mrs. Walker, I presume. I've come to welcome you properly to Willow Springs and to apologize for the shameful behavior of certain members of our community." Elizabeth blinked in surprise. "That's very kind, but unnecessary." "Nonsense," Mrs. Parker interrupted briskly. "When my husband died 15 years ago, leaving me with a business to run and 3 children to raise, I faced similar narrow-mindedness. It's time we moved beyond such outdated prejudices." She settled herself at the kitchen table as if she belonged there. "Now I understand there's to be a harvest ball in Cheyenne. Have you something suitable to wear?" The abrupt change of subject left Elizabeth momentarily speechless. I haven't really considered." "Of course you haven't. You've been busy. Settling in." Mrs. Parker's eyes sparkled with determination. "Well, we'll remedy that. Nothing silences wagging tongues like impeccable presentation. I'll expect you at my shop tomorrow afternoon. We'll find something that makes clear you're a respectable professional, not some tragic figure to be pitied or scandalized over." As Mrs. Parker continued outlining her plans to rehabilitate Elizabeth's reputation through strategic social engagement, Elizabeth caught Matthew's eye across the room. His expression mingled amusement with gratitude, and Elizabeth felt a surge of hope. Perhaps she hadn't just found a job or a purpose, but a community, one that included unexpected allies and the possibility of belonging that transcended society's narrow definitions. The road ahead might still hold challenges, but she no longer faced them alone. Sunday morning arrived with crystalline clarity, the kind of crisp autumn day that made the Wyoming sky seem endless. Elizabeth dressed carefully in her best remaining dress, a deep blue wool that had survived the journey west, and helped Sarah with her hair ribbons, while Matthew wrestled James into his church clothes. "Do we have to go?" James whined, tugging at his collar. "Billy Watson says his pa lets him skip church to go fishing." "The Watsons can make their own choices," Matthew replied firmly, though his hands were gentle as he adjusted his son's tie. "Well, we're going as a family." The word family hung in the air, acknowledged by a quick glance between Matthew and Elizabeth, but left unexamined. Such moments had become more frequent, small recognitions of their evolving dynamic that neither quite dared to name. The ride to town felt different than Elizabeth's previous journeys. Where once she'd been alone and uncertain, now she sat beside Matthew on the wagon seat, while the children chattered behind them. Sarah had insisted on wearing her mother's cameo brooch, a gesture that touched Elizabeth deeply. As they approached the white clapboard church, Elizabeth felt the weight of curious stares. Conversations paused, heads turned, and whispers followed, their progress like rustling leaves. "Steady," Matthew murmured, his hand briefly brushing hers on the wagon seat. "Remember what Mrs. Parker said. Dignity conquers gossip." The church interior smelled of beeswax and old hymn books. The Carson family's usual pew sat empty near the front, and Matthew guided them forward with quiet determination. Elizabeth felt eyes boring into her back, but kept her posture straight, her expression serene. Reverend Mills, a thin man with kind eyes, nodded to them as they settled. The service began normally enough, hymns rising to the rafters, but Elizabeth sensed an undercurrent of tension. Thomas Bennet sat across the aisle, his face flushed with barely contained indignation. During the sermon, ironically about casting the first stone, Elizabeth noticed Sarah's rigid posture beside her. The girl was fighting tears, overwhelmed by the scrutiny and the memories this place held. Without hesitation, Elizabeth reached over and took her hand. Sarah startled, then gripped back fiercely. After the service, as the congregation filed out, the confrontation Elizabeth had been dreading materialized. Thomas Bennet positioned himself at the church door, impossible to avoid. "Carson," he said loudly enough for others to hear, "I see you've brought your household help to worship. How progressive." Matthew's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. "Mrs. Walker is my children's governess, Bennet, a position she fills with excellence. Yes, I'm sure she's very accommodating." The insinuation in Bennet's tone was unmistakable, though one wonders what qualifications a widow brings to such a position beyond certain obvious attractions. Elizabeth felt Matthew tense beside her, but before he could respond, a clear voice cut through the gathering crowd. "Her qualifications, Mr. Bennet, include a teaching certificate from the Chicago Board of Education and 5 years of exemplary service at the Westmore Academy." Mrs. Parker emerged from the crowd, resplendent in peacock blue silk. "I've taken the liberty of verifying Mrs. Walker's credentials through my connections in Chicago. She's more than qualified to educate the Carson children, certainly more qualified than the parade of inadequate housekeepers who've previously attempted the task." Bennet sputtered, wrong-footed by this unexpected defense. "That's not the point, isn't it?" Mrs. Parker's eyebrow arched dangerously. "Or is the point that you're embarrassed by your own lack of judgment? You rejected a perfectly suitable bride based on prejudice, and now you seek to salve your wounded pride by destroying her reputation." The crowd murmured, the tide of opinion shifting. Bennet's face reddened further. "This isn't about me," he protested. "It's about moral standards." "Moral standards." A new voice joined the fray. Dr. Jameson, the town physician, stepped forward. "I treated Margaret Carson in her final days. Those children have suffered enough without your manufactured scandal adding to their burdens. Mrs. Walker has brought stability to that household." Bennet looked around, realizing he was losing his audience. "You're all being deceived by appearances." "The only deception here," Matthew interrupted, his voice carrying quiet authority, "is your pretense of moral concern. You're angry because Mrs. Walker chose to make something of herself, rather than accept your dismissal as final judgment." He turned to address the gathered townspeople. "Elizabeth Walker came to our community seeking a new beginning. Instead of welcome, she found judgment. Instead of compassion, she encountered prejudice, but instead of running, she stayed. She's teaching my children not just arithmetic and literature, but resilience and grace under pressure." Sarah, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, suddenly spoke up. "She's helping me remember Mama without crying all the time. She's teaching James to read better than anyone else could, and she's making our house feel like home again." The simple honesty in Sarah's words seemed to deflate the remaining tension. Several women in the crowd nodded sympathetically, and Elizabeth saw more than one dab at their eyes. Bennet, realizing he'd lost this battle, muttered something about having business elsewhere and pushed through the crowd. As he departed, Elizabeth felt the atmosphere shift, curiosity replacing hostility. Mrs. Parker seized the moment. "Now that's settled. I hope you'll all welcome Mrs. Walker properly to our community. She'll be attending the harvest ball in Cheyenne as part of the Carson household, and I expect she'll be treated with the respect she deserves." The announcement created a buzz of interest, effectively redirecting the gossip from scandal to social anticipation. As people began dispersing, several women approached Elizabeth with cautious friendliness, asking about her teaching methods or commenting on how well the children looked. Later, over Sunday dinner at the ranch, the morning's events were dissected. With a mixture of relief and lingering concern, "Mrs. Parker was magnificent," Elizabeth said, helping herself to roasted potatoes. "I had no idea she'd investigated my background." Matthew smiled. "Adeline Parker doesn't do anything by halves. When she decides to champion a cause or a person, she commits completely." "Why did she help us?" James asked through a mouthful of chicken. "Because she understands what it's like to be judged unfairly," Elizabeth explained. "Sometimes people who've faced hardship are the quickest to recognize it in others." Sarah, who had been quiet since church, suddenly looked up. "Was it hard for you when your husband died?" The directness of the question momentarily startled Elizabeth, but she recognized the need behind it, Sarah's continuing struggle to process her own loss. "Yes," Elizabeth answered honestly. "Very hard. People expected me to behave in certain ways, to wear black forever, to never laugh or find joy in anything. Some thought I should give up teaching and live with relatives. When I didn't follow their expectations, they gossiped, just like Mr. Bennett did today." "But you didn't let them stop you," Sarah observed. "No, I didn't, because I knew that Robert, my husband, would have wanted me to live fully, not just exist in shadows." Matthew's fork paused midway to his mouth, something shifting in his expression. "Margaret would have liked you," he said quietly. "She had strong opinions about women's rights to make their own choices." The mention of Margaret no longer brought awkward silence. Instead, it opened a door to sharing memories. Matthew telling stories of Margaret's determination to start a library in Willow Springs, the children adding their own recollections of their mother's various projects and passions. As Elizabeth listened, she realized that healing was happening around this table. Not the erasure of grief, but its transformation into something that could coexist with new beginnings. The following weeks brought a flurry of preparation for the harvest ball. True to her word, Mrs. Parker took Elizabeth's wardrobe in hand, producing a gown of midnight blue silk that managed to be both elegant and appropriately modest. "The key," Mrs. Parker explained during a fitting, "is to strike the right balance. You're not trying to attract suitors. Heaven forbid, that would only fuel gossip. You're presenting yourself as a professional woman of dignity and refinement." Elizabeth studied her reflection, hardly recognizing herself. The dress emphasized her slim waist while maintaining perfect propriety, and Mrs. Parker had insisted on updating her hairstyle to something softer than her usual severe bun. "I feel like I'm playing a role," Elizabeth confessed. "Nonsense. You're simply showing a different facet of yourself." Mrs. Parker adjusted a sleeve critically. "The same woman who can teach Latin can also dance a waltz. One doesn't negate the other." At the ranch, dance lessons became part of the evening routine. Matthew proved surprisingly adept, though he admitted it had been years since he'd attempted anything more complex than a simple reel. "Margaret loved to dance," he explained one evening as they practiced in the cleared parlor, the children providing musical accompaniment on a harmonica and a washboard. "She said dancing was like conversation without words." Elizabeth stumbled slightly, and Matthew's hand at her waist steadied her. The touch, though proper and necessary, sent an unexpected warmth through her. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I'm out of practice." "You're doing fine," he assured her, guiding her through another turn. "Better than fine, actually." Their eyes met, and for a moment the pretense of practice fell away. They were simply a man and woman, moving in harmony, sharing space and breath and something unnamed but increasingly undeniable. "Papa," James interrupted. "You're supposed to be teaching her, not just staring." The spell broken, they stepped apart, both slightly flushed. Sarah, more observant than her brother, watched them with a speculative expression that seemed far too knowing for her years. The day of the ball arrived with unseasonable warmth, Indian summer gracing the territory with golden light. The journey to Cheyenne took most of the day, with an overnight stay planned at a respectable hotel. Mrs. Parker had arranged for a trusted neighbor to stay with James at the ranch, while Sarah accompanied them, her first grown-up social event. As they approached the governor's mansion that evening, Elizabeth felt a flutter of nerves. Carriages lined the curved drive, depositing elegantly dressed couples beneath glowing lanterns. This was society on a scale she hadn't encountered since leaving Chicago. "Remember," Matthew said quietly as he helped her from the carriage, "you belong here as much as anyone." The ballroom blazed with light from crystal chandeliers, the air heavy with perfume and the strains of a professional orchestra. Elizabeth had expected frontier simplicity, but the territorial governor had spared no expense. This could have been Boston or Philadelphia. Their entrance drew attention, whispers rippling through the crowd. But this time, the tone was different, curious rather than condemning. Mrs. Parker's groundwork had been effective. "Matthew Carson," the governor boomed, approaching with outstretched hand. "Good to see you, and this must be the governess I've heard so much about." "Mrs. Elizabeth Walker," Matthew introduced, "and my daughter, Sarah." The governor's wife, a gracious woman with silver hair, immediately took Sarah under her wing, introducing her to other young people. Elizabeth watched the girl blossom under the attention, her usual solemnity giving way to cautious excitement. As the evening progressed, Elizabeth found herself drawn into conversations about education reform in the territories, her opinions sought and respected. The anticipated censure never materialized. Instead, she discovered a community hungry for culture and advancement. "Shall we dance?" Matthew asked, as a waltz began. Elizabeth accepted his hand, and they moved onto the floor with the natural ease born of their practice sessions. But this was different. The formal setting, the music, the awareness of eyes upon them, all combined to create a charged atmosphere. "You're full of surprises, Mrs. Walker," Matthew murmured as they turned. "The society ladies are quite impressed with your thoughts on curriculum development. And you, Mr. Carson, dance remarkably well for a cattleman." His smile softened his weathered features. "We all have hidden depths." As they moved through the steps, Elizabeth became aware of a subtle shift in how others perceived them. The scandal Bennett had tried to create was dissolving, replaced by something else, speculation of a different kind. "They're wondering if we're courting," she whispered, catching knowing glances from several matrons. Matthew's hand tightened slightly at her waist. Would that be so terrible? The question, asked with careful casualness, sent Elizabeth's heart racing. Before she could formulate a response, the music ended, and they were swept into the social whirl once more. Later, as the evening wound down, Elizabeth stepped onto the terrace for air. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like spilled diamonds. She didn't hear Matthew approach until he spoke. "Sarah's having the time of her life. Thank you for encouraging her to come." Elizabeth turned, finding him closer than expected. "She deserves moments of pure joy. You all do. As do you." He paused, seeming to gather courage. "Elizabeth, may I call you that? These past months have changed everything. When I asked you to come to the ranch, I thought I was offering you refuge and my children a teacher. I didn't expect—" Didn't expect what? She prompted softly. To find myself looking forward to our evening conversations, to feel my heart lift when you enter a room, to realize that what began as a practical arrangement has become something far more precious. Elizabeth's breath caught. Matthew, I'm not asking for an answer tonight, he interrupted gently. We both carry our pasts, our losses. But I want you to know that you've brought light back into our lives, not as a replacement for what we've lost, but as something new and valuable in its own right. Standing there in the starlight, Elizabeth felt the last of her defenses crumble. She'd come west seeking a fresh start, only to face rejection. Yet that very rejection had led her here, to this moment, this man, this unexpected possibility of love, born from shared understanding and mutual respect. I never expected this either, she admitted, but I've learned that life's most precious gifts often come disguised as disappointments. Matthew reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. Then perhaps we should stop expecting and start hoping. Inside, the orchestra struck up the final waltz. Without another word, Matthew led her back to the ballroom, where they danced once more, not as employer and governess, not as widow and widower, but as two people discovering that broken hearts, when given time and tenderness, could indeed learn to love again. The weeks following the harvest ball passed in a haze of cautious joy. While Matthew and Elizabeth hadn't formally announced any change in their relationship, the subtle shift was apparent to everyone at the ranch. Matthew lingered longer over evening coffee, their conversations stretching past propriety. Elizabeth found herself humming while working in Margaret's slowly reviving garden. Even the children sensed something different. Sarah's watchful eyes held approval rather than wariness, and James had taken to calling Elizabeth Aunt Lizzie, without correction. But as October gave way to November, storm clouds gathered both literally and figuratively. The first blizzard of the season struck with unexpected ferocity, trapping 2 of Matthew's ranch hands in the north pasture with 100 head of cattle. I have to go after them, Matthew announced, already pulling on his heavy coat as wind rattled the windows. In this weather? Elizabeth protested, watching snow swirl past in horizontal sheets. You can barely see past the porch. Tom and Miguel have families. Those cattle represent half our winter profit. Matthew checked his rifle, his movements efficient but tense. I know this land. I'll find them. Elizabeth wanted to argue further, but she recognized the set of his jaw, the same determination she'd seen when he defended her at church. Instead, she helped him gather supplies, blankets, coffee, dried beef. Promise me you'll be careful, she said quietly as he prepared to leave. Matthew paused, then pulled her into a brief, fierce embrace, their first physical contact beyond dancing. Take care of the children. If I'm not back by morning, send a word to Sheriff Clayton. Then he was gone, swallowed by the white fury beyond the door. The hours crawled by. Elizabeth kept the children occupied with lessons and games, but her attention constantly strayed to the windows, searching for any sign of Matthew's return. As darkness fell, the storm intensified rather than abating. He'll be fine, Sarah said with forced brightness, though her knuckles were white where she gripped her arithmetic slate. Papa knows every inch of this ranch. James, less adept at hiding his fear, climbed into Elizabeth's lap during their evening reading. Will Papa get lost like Mama did? Elizabeth's heart clenched. What do you mean, sweetheart? Mama went to town when I was sick, James whispered. The snow came, and she got turned around coming home. That's why she got the fever. Elizabeth looked at Sarah, who nodded reluctantly. She was trying to get medicine for James. Got caught in the late spring storm. By the time Papa found her, she'd been wandering for hours. The revelation cast Matthew's determination to find his men in a new light. This wasn't just about cattle or profit. It was about preventing another tragedy born of Wyoming's merciless weather. Your papa is very experienced, Elizabeth assured. In them, though her own anxiety grew. And he's not ill or confused like your mama was. He'll find shelter if needed." Night deepened, and still Matthew didn't return. Elizabeth put the children to bed, sitting with them until they finally succumbed to exhausted sleep. Then she took up her own vigil by the kitchen window, wrapped in a shawl, watching snow pile against the glass. Near midnight, she heard it, a faint shout carried on the wind. Grabbing a lantern, she rushed to the door. 3 figures materialized from the swirling white. Matthew supporting Tom, while Miguel stumbled alongside. "Get them inside," Matthew ordered, his voice hoarse. "They are frozen." Elizabeth helped guide the men to the kitchen, where she'd kept the stove burning. Tom and Miguel were indeed in poor shape, fingers and faces raw from exposure. While Matthew shed his ice-crusted outer layers, Elizabeth set about making hot. "A coffee and fetching blankets. The cattle," she asked as she worked, "lost about 20 head, Matthew replied grimly. "But it could have been worse. Found these 2 huddled in a snow cave they dug." As Elizabeth tended to the men, she noticed Matthew favoring his left side. "You're hurt." "It's nothing. Horse slipped, threw me into some rocks." But when Elizabeth insisted on examining him, she found extensive bruising and possibly cracked ribs. "You need the doctor," she declared. "In this storm, don't be foolish." Matthew winced as she helped him remove his shirt. "I've had worse from breaking horses." Elizabeth cleaned and bandaged his injuries with gentle efficiency, achingly aware of the intimacy of the moment. Matthew's skin was warm beneath her fingers, his breathing careful and controlled. "Thank you," he murmured when she finished, "for everything, taking charge here, caring for the children." "It's what family does," Elizabeth replied softly. Their eyes met, and the word family hung between them, weighted with new meaning. Before either could speak further, Tom groaned from his makeshift bed near the stove, breaking the moment. The storm continued through the night and into the next day. Elizabeth found herself running the household with newfound authority, nursing the injured men, keeping the children calm, maintaining the essential chores despite the weather. Matthew, forced to rest by his injuries, watched her with open admiration. "You're remarkable," he said on the second evening, as she brought him fresh bandages. "Most women would be overwhelmed by all this." "I'm not most women," Elizabeth replied with a small smile. "Widowhood teaches you to handle whatever life throws your way." By the 3rd day, the storm had passed, leaving the ranch buried under pristine white. As Tom and Miguel recovered enough to return to their families, Matthew insisted on accompanying Elizabeth outside to assess the damage. The world had been transformed into a glittering wonderland. Sunlight sparkled off snow-laden trees, and the air held that peculiar clarity that follows blizzards. As they walked toward the barn, Matthew suddenly stopped. "Elizabeth, wait!" She turned, puzzled by his serious tone. Matthew stood in the snow, his expression intense. "When I was out there, searching for Tom and Miguel, all I could think about was getting back to you and the children. Not just because of duty or responsibility, but because—" He took a deep breath. "Because somewhere in these past months, you've become essential to me. Not as an employee, or even as a friend, but as the woman I love." Elizabeth's heart thundered in her chest. "Matthew, I know it's soon. I know we both have pasts that make us cautious. But nearly losing everything in that storm made me realize how precious time is." He stepped closer, taking her gloved hands in his. "I'm not asking you to forget Robert or replace what you had with him. I'm asking if you might consider building something new with me." Tears pricked Elizabeth's eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition of a second chance she'd never expected. "When I came west," she said slowly, "I thought I was seeking a practical arrangement, marriage as a means of survival. When that failed, I thought I was accepting a job. I never imagined I'd find a home, a family, and—" She squeezed his hands. "And love, yes, Matthew, yes, to building something new." His kiss was gentle, reverent, a promise sealed in the crisp winter air. When they parted, both were smiling through tears. "The children will be thrilled," Matthew said, grinning. "I suspect they knew before we did," Elizabeth laughed. Their joy was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A rider appeared. On this snow-covered trail, Sheriff Clayton, his face grim. "Matthew, Mrs. Walker," he called, dismounting. "I've got news you need to hear. Thomas Bennett's been arrested in Cheyenne." "Arrested?" Matthew frowned. "For what?" "Fraud. Seems he's been running a scheme, advertising for mail-order brides, taking their traveling money, then finding reasons to reject them, keeping the funds they'd saved for establishing themselves." The sheriff's expression softened as he looked at Elizabeth. "You weren't the first, ma'am. Just the first to stay and make something of yourself despite his cruelty." Elizabeth felt Matthew's arm come around her waist, steady and protective. The news should have brought satisfaction, but instead she felt only pity. "How many women?" she asked quietly. "At least 6 that we know of. Most went back east, too ashamed to speak up. But one, a young woman from St. Louis, she went to the authorities, started an investigation." "Will there be a trial?" Matthew asked. "Most likely. The territorial prosecutor may want Mrs. Walker's testimony." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "If it helps prevent other women from suffering similar treatment, I'll testify." After the sheriff departed, Matthew and Elizabeth stood in the snow, processing this unexpected development. "Does it bring you any peace?" Matthew asked. "Knowing he'll face justice?" Elizabeth considered the question carefully. "It brings me a validation, I suppose, but my peace comes from what I've found, not from his punishment." She turned to face him fully. "If he hadn't rejected me, I never would have met you. In a strange way, his cruelty led to my greatest happiness." That evening, they gathered the children to share their news. Sarah, with wisdom beyond her years, simply nodded and said, "It's about time." James was more exuberant, immediately asking if this meant Elizabeth would be his real mother now. "If you'll have me," Elizabeth replied, opening her arms to embrace them both. As they began planning their future, a small wedding before Christmas perhaps, a knock at the door interrupted their celebration. Matthew opened it to find Mrs. Parker standing on the porch, beaming. "I heard about Bennett's arrest," she announced, sweeping inside without waiting for an invitation. "And I have a proposition for you both." Over coffee and cake, Mrs. Parker outlined her idea. "With Bennett's business in scandal, Willow Springs needs new leadership. I'm forming a committee to establish a proper school, not just a one-room schoolhouse, but a real academy. We need someone with your experience, Elizabeth, to head it." Elizabeth glanced at Matthew, who nodded encouragingly. "But the ranch, the children, would benefit from having their mother shape education for the entire community," Mrs. Parker finished. "You could hold classes 3 days a week, design curriculum that serves both town and ranch children, bring some of that Chicago refinement to our frontier." The offer was unexpected, but intriguing. Elizabeth had found purpose in teaching Sarah and James, but the opportunity to influence broader educational development stirred her professional ambitions. "Could I have time to consider?" she asked. "Of course, but don't take too long. Progress waits for no one, not even newlyweds." Mrs. Parker's eyes twinkled knowingly. After she left, Matthew and Elizabeth sat together on the porch, watching stars emerge in the clear winter sky. "A school," Elizabeth mused. "I never imagined—" "You'd be perfect for it," Matthew said. "And it would show everyone that your coming here wasn't just about finding a husband or a job. It was about bringing something valuable to our community." Elizabeth leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. "When I stepped," Off that stagecoach, rejected and alone, I thought my life was over. Now look at us, planning a wedding, building a family, possibly founding a school. Life has a way of surprising us, Matthew agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. The trick is being brave enough to embrace the surprises. As the night deepened, around them, Elizabeth reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She'd been rejected for her past, only to find someone who saw that very past as preparation for their shared future. She'd been deemed unsuitable for conventional marriage, only to discover a love deeper than convention could contain. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, testimony about Bennett's crimes, wedding preparations, decisions about the school. But tonight, sitting with Matthew under the vast Wyoming sky, Elizabeth knew she had found something more precious than social acceptance or financial security. She had found a place where her whole self, past and present, grief and joy, experience and hope, was not just accepted, but celebrated. In the kitchen, she could hear Sarah helping James with his spelling, while the stove crackled warmly. Through the window, the first lights of Willow Springs twinkled in the distance, and here on the porch, Matthew's steady presence beside her spoke of all the tomorrows yet to come. She had traveled west, seeking a new beginning. What she'd found was infinitely better, a continuation of her story, enriched by everything that had come before, promising everything still to be written. The Carson Ranch buzzed with activity in the weeks leading up to Christmas. Wedding preparations mingled with holiday traditions, creating an atmosphere of joyful chaos. Elizabeth found herself at the center of it all, no longer an outsider, but the heart around which the household revolved. "The dress needs more lace," Mrs. Parker declared, studying Elizabeth's wedding gown with a critical eye. They stood in Elizabeth's room, surrounded by fabric swatches and ribbon samples. "You're not just marrying a rancher, you're becoming a community leader." Elizabeth smoothed the ivory silk, a gift from Matthew, who'd insisted she have something new rather than wearing her old wedding dress. "I never imagined having a second wedding, let alone one with such attention." "Second chances deserve proper celebration," Mrs. Parker replied firmly. "Besides, after Bennett's scandal, this town needs something pure to believe in." The news of Thomas Bennett's arrest had indeed rocked Willow Springs. As more details emerged, 7 women defrauded, thousands of dollars stolen, the community's attitude toward Elizabeth transformed from suspicious tolerance to protective admiration. She'd become a symbol of resilience, her upcoming marriage. To Matthew, seen as a triumph over adversity. "Mrs. Walker," Sarah's voice came from the doorway, "the Reverend is here about the ceremony." Elizabeth smiled at her soon-to-be stepdaughter. Sarah had blossomed in recent weeks, her grief-shadowed eyes brightening as she embraced her role in wedding preparations. She'd even asked, shyly, if she might call Elizabeth Mother after the wedding. Downstairs, Reverend Mills sat in the parlor, with Matthew discussing logistics. The ceremony would be simple but meaningful, held in the small church on Christmas Eve, followed by a reception at the ranch. "Ah, Mrs. Walker," the Reverend greeted her warmly. "We were just discussing the vows. I understand you'd like to include something about building new families while honoring past loves?" Elizabeth nodded, taking a seat beside Matthew. His hand found hers naturally, their fingers intertwining. "Both Matthew and I have loved and lost. We want our ceremony to acknowledge that our hearts have room for both memory and new love." "A beautiful sentiment," Reverend Mills agreed. "Perhaps something about love's capacity to expand rather than replace." As they refined the ceremony details, Elizabeth marveled at how different this felt from her first wedding planning. With Robert, everything had been dictated by family expectations and social conventions. This time, each choice reflected their authentic selves and unique situation. Later that evening, After the Reverend departed and the children were in bed, Matthew and Elizabeth sat by the fire, reviewing plans for the school Mrs. Parker had proposed. The old mercantile building would work well, Matthew mused, studying sketches Elizabeth had made. It's spacious, central, and Bennett's creditors are eager to sell. The irony doesn't escape me, Elizabeth replied. His business of deception transformed into a place of learning, Matthew chuckled. Poetic justice. Speaking of which, the prosecutor sent word. Bennett's trial is set for January. They'll want your testimony. Elizabeth sighed. I know it's necessary, but I'd rather focus on building our future than revisiting that humiliation. You won't face it alone, Matthew assured her. I'll be right beside you. The whole town will support you now. The fire crackled companionably as they continued planning. Elizabeth's vision for the school expanded beyond basic education. She imagined a place where practical skills met cultural enrichment, where ranch children learned alongside town children, breaking down the artificial barriers between rural and urban life. Margaret would have loved this, Matthew said softly. She always said education was the great equalizer. Elizabeth squeezed his hand. Tell me more about her dreams for the children's education. I want to honor her vision too. This had become their way, weaving memories of their late spouses into their new life, creating continuity rather than replacement. Matthew shared Margaret's hopes for their children, and Elizabeth found ways to incorporate those ideals into her curriculum plans. The week before Christmas brought an unexpected visitor. A young woman appeared at the ranch, travel-worn and hesitant, clutching a letter. I'm looking for Mrs. Elizabeth Walker, she said when Matthew answered the door. Elizabeth came forward, curious. I'm Elizabeth. My name is Clara Henshaw. I was one of Bennett's victims. The woman's voice trembled. I heard about your wedding, about how you've made a life here despite what he did. I had to meet you. Elizabeth guided Clara inside, sensing the depth of pain behind her words. Over tea, Clara's story emerged. Another teaching position abandoned, savings surrendered for a promised future that never materialized. Unlike Elizabeth, Clara had returned east in shame, too broken to fight back. When I read about his arrest, about your testimony, something in me awakened, Clara explained. I realized I'd let him steal more than money. I'd let him steal my belief in second chances. Elizabeth listened with compassion born of shared experience. Starting over isn't easy, but it is possible. That's why I've come, Clara said, determination replacing despair in her eyes. I want to testify too, and afterward, would you consider hiring me for your school? I have credentials in mathematics and science. The request surprised Elizabeth, but as she looked at this young woman fighting to reclaim her life, she saw an opportunity for the kind of redemption that had saved her own life. We'd be honored to have you, Elizabeth replied. Though I should warn you, frontier teaching requires flexibility and courage. I'm learning that courage comes from facing what frightens us, Clara said with a small smile. You've shown me that. Matthew, who'd been listening quietly, nodded approval. The ranch has a small cottage where our foreman lived before he married. You're welcome to stay there until you get established. Clara's gratitude was palpable. As they settled her into the cottage, Elizabeth reflected on how pain, when transformed, could become purpose. Her own rejection had led not just to personal happiness, but to creating opportunities for others. Christmas Eve arrived with crystalline perfection. Fresh snow blanketed the landscape, and the church glowed with candlelight as guests gathered. Elizabeth stood in the small vestry, adjusting her veil while Sarah fussed with her own bridesmaid dress. You look beautiful, Sarah whispered, awe in her voice. As do you, Elizabeth replied, kissing the girl's forehead. Thank you for sharing your father with me. Sarah's eyes glistened. Thank you for making him smile again, for making us all smile. Mrs. Parker appeared in the doorway. "It's time." The ceremony unfolded like a dream. James served as ring-bearer with solemn pride. Sarah stood beside Elizabeth, radiant in pale blue. The congregation included not just townsfolk, but ranch hands, neighbors, and even some of the territorial officials who'd attended the harvest ball. Matthew's eyes never left Elizabeth as she walked down the aisle. When they joined hands at the altar, Elizabeth felt the weight of their journey, from rejection to acceptance, from loneliness to love. Reverend Mills's words resonated through the small church. "We gather to witness not just a union of two people, but the creation of a new family from the tender threads of loss and hope." Matthew and Elizabeth have chosen to honor their pasts while embracing their future, showing us all that love's capacity is infinite. The vows they'd crafted together spoke of building rather than replacing, of growing rather than forgetting. When Matthew slipped the ring on her finger, Elizabeth felt Robert's blessing as surely as she felt Margaret's. "By the power vested in me," Reverend Mills concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Their kiss sealed more than a marriage. It celebrated triumph over prejudice, resilience over despair, and love's ability to bloom in unexpected soil. The reception at the ranch lasted well into the night. Tables groaned under Mrs. Turner's feast, and the barn had been transformed with lanterns and evergreen boughs. Elizabeth danced with Matthew, with the children, even with Sheriff Clayton, who'd become an unexpected ally. Clara Henshaw attended, sitting quietly at first, but gradually drawn into conversations about the upcoming school. Several other women approached Elizabeth throughout the evening, sharing their own stories of widowhood or abandonment, expressing interest in the educational opportunities she planned to create. "You've started something," Mrs. Parker observed as the evening wound down. "Not just a school, but a movement. Women supporting women, education breaking barriers." Elizabeth surveyed the scene, her new family, her growing circle of friends and allies, the community that had evolved from suspicious to supportive. "We've all started something together." As the last guests departed and the children were tucked into bed, Matthew and Elizabeth stood on the porch, wrapped in quilts against the winter chill. "Mrs. Carson," Matthew murmured, testing the sound. "How does it feel?" "Like coming home," Elizabeth replied. "Not to a place I've been before, but to where I was always meant to be." They watched snow fall gently, covering the ranch in pristine white, a blank page awaiting new stories. "Tomorrow we start converting the mercantile," Elizabeth said, already planning. "Clara can help with inventory and curriculum. We'll need to hire at least one more teacher," and Matthew silenced her with a kiss. "Tomorrow, tonight is for us." Elizabeth leaned into his embrace, marveling at life's circuitous paths. She'd boarded a train west expecting one kind of future, faced rejection that seemed catastrophic, and found instead a destiny richer than her original dreams. In the quiet of their first night as husband and wife, Elizabeth offered a silent prayer of gratitude for second chances, for love that encompassed both past and present, and for the courage to transform pain into purpose. The Double C Ranch slept peacefully under its blanket of snow, no longer a refuge for the rejected, but a beacon of hope for all who sought new beginnings. And in the master bedroom, two people who'd thought their hearts too scarred to love again discovered that broken vessels, when mended with gold, become more beautiful than before. As Elizabeth drifted towards sleep in Matthew's arms, she thought of the school they would build, the testimony she would give, the family they were creating. Each challenge ahead seemed surmountable now, not because the path was easy, but because she no longer walked it alone. The future stretched before them like the untouched snow, pristine, full of possibility, waiting to be shaped by hope and determination. And Elizabeth Carson, once rejected for her past, now embraced for her whole self, was ready to help write the next chapter of not just her own story, but of every woman who dared to believe in second chances. January arrived with bitter cold and the weight of approaching testimony. Elizabeth stood before her wardrobe, selecting clothes for Bennett's trial with the same care she'd given her wedding dress. Clara waited in the parlor below, equally anxious about facing the man who'd shattered their trust. "Wear the burgundy suit," Matthew suggested from the doorway. "You look strong in it, authoritative." Elizabeth fingered the wool fabric. "I want to appear credible, not vindictive." "You are credible, a respected educator, a rancher's wife, soon to be headmistress of Willow Springs Academy." Matthew crossed the room, placing steady hands on her shoulders. "Bennett's the one who should worry about appearances." The territorial courthouse in Cheyenne bustled with activity when they arrived. Word of the trial had spread, a cautionary tale about frontier schemes and women's vulnerability. Reporters from as far as Denver crowded the steps, eager for details. "Mrs. Carson," a young journalist called, "how does it feel to face the man who rejected you?" Elizabeth paused, Clara trembling beside her. "I face him not as a rejected bride, but as a woman who found strength in adversity. This trial isn't about revenge. It's about protecting other women from similar deception." Inside, the courtroom filled quickly. Thomas Bennett sat at the defense table, his former Polish dulled by months in custody. His eyes widened when he saw Elizabeth enter with Matthew, their unity a stark contrast to his isolation. The prosecutor, a sharp-featured woman named Helen Blackwood, had specifically requested a female attorney for this case, itself a rarity in territorial courts. "Mrs. Carson," she began after Elizabeth was sworn in, "please describe your initial correspondence with the defendant." Elizabeth spoke clearly, detailing the months of letters, the promises made, the journey west. The courtroom listened in rapt silence as she recounted that humiliating scene on Willow Springs Main Street. "He called you damaged goods," Miss Blackwood emphasized. "Because of your widowhood?" "Yes, despite never explicitly asking about my marital history in our correspondence. And the money you'd saved for establishing yourself, what became of that?" "Gone. The journey consumed most of my resources. I was left with barely enough for 2 nights' lodging." Bennett's attorney, a nervous young man clearly out of his depth, attempted to paint Elizabeth as deceptive. "Didn't you conceal your previous marriage, Mrs. Carson?" Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. "I planned to discuss it in person, believing such intimate matters deserved face-to-face conversation. I never lied. I simply hadn't yet shared that part of my history." "Yet you accepted his money for travel under false pretenses." "Objection," Ms. Blackwood interrupted. "The witness has testified she intended full disclosure upon arrival." "Sustained," the judge ruled. As the cross-examination continued, Elizabeth felt Matthew's supportive presence in the gallery. She drew strength from knowing her life had become evidence itself, proof that Bennett's cruelty had backfired spectacularly. Clara's testimony followed, her voice gaining confidence as she described similar deception. Then came others, women, who'd traveled from various territories to share their stories. The pattern became undeniable. Bennett had systematically targeted vulnerable women, extracting their savings while never intending marriage. The most damaging evidence came from Bennett's own records seized during his arrest. Meticulous notes about each woman's financial status, strategies for rejection, even cruel nicknames he'd assigned them. Elizabeth was listed as the pretender, widow masquerading as maiden. During a recess, Elizabeth encountered Bennett in The corridor, his bravado had crumbled, leaving a deflated man who couldn't meet her eyes. "I suppose you're satisfied," he muttered, "destroying my reputation." "You destroyed your own reputation," Elizabeth replied calmly. "I simply refused to let you destroy my future as well. I gave you an opportunity, you gave me humiliation, but in doing so, you gave me something far more valuable, the chance to discover my own resilience." Elizabeth gestured to Matthew, who stood protectively nearby. "Your rejection led me to a man who values not just what I am, but who I've been, and who I might become." Bennett's face contorted with bitterness. "Playing the noble victim, you've certainly perfected the role." "There's nothing noble about victimhood," Elizabeth countered. "The nobility lies in refusing to remain a victim. Every woman you deceived has that choice. Thanks to this trial, they're choosing strength over shame." The verdict came swiftly. Guilty on all counts, Bennett received 7 years in territorial prison and orders to make financial restitution. As they left the courthouse, Elizabeth felt not triumph but relief. A chapter closed, allowing full focus on the future. "You were magnificent," Matthew said as they boarded the train home. "Composed, articulate, powerful." "I was terrified," Elizabeth admitted, but facing him, seeing how small and petty his prejudices truly were, it freed something in me. Clara, riding with them, nodded vigorously. "You gave us all courage today. I've decided I want to specialize in educating women about their legal rights, prevention through knowledge." Elizabeth smiled, recognizing another transformation born from adversity. "The Academy will have a civics component. You'll lead it." Back in Willow Springs, news of the verdict preceded them. A crowd gathered at the station, cheering as Elizabeth disembarked. Mrs. Parker pushed forward, waving architectural plans. "The renovations begin next week." The school board approved everything, including dormitories for students from outlying ranches. The following months blurred with activity. The old mercantile transformed under Elizabeth's vision. Classrooms flooded with natural light, a library stocked with donated books, an assembly hall that doubled as community theatre. Margaret's garden inspired a botanical teaching area where students could learn both science and beauty. By spring, Willow Springs Academy stood ready. The opening ceremony drew territorial dignitaries, including the governor himself. Elizabeth stood at the podium, surveying an audience that included ranchers alongside merchants, former skeptics beside ardent supporters. "Education," she began, "is not merely the transmission of facts, but the cultivation of possibility. This academy represents more than a school. It embodies our community's commitment to growth, equality, and second chances." Sarah and James sat in the front row, beaming with pride. At 14, Sarah had blossomed into a confident young woman, serving as student ambassador for younger pupils. James, now 10, showed remarkable artistic talent, his drawings adorning the academy's walls. The first term brought challenges, balancing diverse student needs, managing staff, maintaining academic standards while honoring practical requirements. But Elizabeth thrived, her days filled with purpose, her evenings enriched by family. One particularly memorable moment came when a group of Native American children from the nearby reservation enrolled. Their parents, initially wary, had been convinced by Elizabeth's curriculum that honored multiple cultural perspectives. "Knowledge belongs to no single tradition," she explained at a parent meeting. "We'll study Shakespeare alongside tribal stories, European mathematics beside indigenous astronomy." This inclusive approach occasionally drew criticism from traditionalists, but Elizabeth stood firm, supported by Matthew and a growing coalition of progressive citizens. By the Academy's first anniversary, enrollment had doubled. Former students returned as junior instructors. Clara's civics program gained territorial recognition. The dormitories housed students from 3 neighboring counties. One evening, as Elizabeth reviewed graduation plans, Matthew entered her study with a peculiar expression. "There's someone here to see you, a journalist from Boston." Elizabeth looked up, surprised. "Boston?" The visitor introduced herself as Catherine Mills from the Boston Educational Journal. "We've heard remarkable things about your academy. Progressive education in the territories, bridging cultural divides, empowering women. I'd like to feature your story." As Elizabeth toured the journalist through the academy, sharing its evolution from personal tragedy to community triumph, she recognized how far she'd traveled, not just geographically, but emotionally, professionally, spiritually. "You were a respected teacher in Boston," Catherine observed. "Do you ever regret leaving?" Elizabeth paused in Margaret's memorial garden, where irises bloomed in profusion. "Regret? No. Everything I experienced, the loss, the rejection, the struggle, prepared me for this. In Boston, I taught from books. Here, I teach from life." Article published months later brought national attention. Letters arrived from educators across the country, seeking advice on replicating the Academy's model. Elizabeth found herself invited to speak at conferences, her message of resilience and innovation resonating beyond territorial boundaries. Yet amid growing acclaim, she remained grounded in daily realities, helping Sarah prepare for eventual college, guiding James through adolescence, nurturing her marriage to Matthew. The ranch flourished alongside the academy, their dual successes intertwining. One autumn afternoon, as Elizabeth walked home from the academy, she encountered a familiar figure at the town's edge. Thomas Bennett, recently released and notably aged, stood uncertainly by the road. "Mrs. Carson," he said, his voice lacking its former arrogance. "Might I have a word?" Elizabeth studied him, this man whose cruelty had inadvertently shaped her destiny. "What is it, Mr. Bennett? I've come to—" He struggled with the words, "to acknowledge my wrongs. Prison gave me time to reflect. What I did was unconscionable." "Yes, it was. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I understand now. What I saw as flaws, your widowhood, your independence, were actually strengths I was too small to recognize." Elizabeth considered his words. "Understanding is a beginning, Mr. Bennett. What matters now is what you do with that understanding. I'm leaving the territory, starting fresh somewhere I can do honest work." He hesitated. "The academy, it's remarkable. You've built something lasting from something broken." "We all have that capacity," Elizabeth replied. "Even you, if you choose." As Bennett walked away, diminished, but perhaps finally capable of growth, Elizabeth felt the last vestiges of old pain dissolve. She'd transformed his rejection into purpose, his cruelty into compassion, his narrow vision into expansive possibility. That evening, gathered with her family for dinner, Elizabeth shared the encounter. Matthew reached for her hand across the table. "Are you all right?" "More than all right," she assured him. Seeing him like that, humbled, seeking redemption, reminded me how grateful I am for every step of this journey, even the painful ones. Sarah, now preparing her own college applications, smiled knowingly. "You always say the best teachers are those who've learned from difficulty and keep learning," Elizabeth added. "Always." As night settled over the ranch, Elizabeth stood on the porch where she and Matthew had shared so many conversations. The lights of Willow Springs twinkled in the distance, the academy standing proudly among them, a beacon of hope she'd helped create. Matthew joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Just reflecting on how a moment of rejection became a lifetime of purpose, how saying no to one future opened the door to a better one. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. Elizabeth turned in his embrace, seeing in his weathered face all the love and partnership that had grown between them. "Not one. This life, our family, the academy, the community we've helped shape. It's more than I ever dreamed possible. Above them, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles, yet somehow blessing them with their distant light. Elizabeth Carson, once rejected as unsuitable, now stood as living proof that broken dreams, properly tended, can blossom into realities more beautiful than originally imagined. 10 years had transformed Willow Springs from a frontier outpost into a thriving community, with Elizabeth Carson's Academy at its cultural heart. The morning of the institution's 10th anniversary dawned bright and clear, bringing visitors from across the territory and beyond. Elizabeth stood before her mirror, adjusting the academic robes she'd never expected to wear again. At 40, threads of silver wove through her dark hair, and laugh lines framed eyes that had witnessed both sorrow and joy. Matthew appeared behind her, still tall and strong, though his beard now showed distinguished grey. "The delegation from Washington has arrived," he said, placing gentle hands on her shoulders. "They're eager to discuss replicating your educational model nationwide." Elizabeth turned, straightening his tie with practiced familiarity. "And the ranch? You'll manage without me today?" Matthew chuckled. "Sarah's handling the morning rounds." Before her speech, "Hard to believe our little girl is graduating from medical college next month." Their eldest had indeed followed an unconventional path, inspired by Elizabeth's example to pursue education despite societal expectations. Sarah would return to Willow Springs as its first female physician, another barrier broken. "And James?" Elizabeth asked, already at the academy arranging his art exhibition. The gallery owner from San Francisco seemed quite impressed yesterday. James, now 20, had developed his artistic talents into a promising career, his paintings capturing the evolving West with sensitivity inherited from both parents. As they descended the stairs, Elizabeth paused at the family portrait hanging in the hallway. Painted 5 years ago, it showed their blended family. Matthew and Elizabeth centered, Sarah and James flanking them, and 3 younger children gathered close, twin daughters Hope and Faith, now 8 and 5-year-old Robert Matthew Carson. Named for both their lost loves, the academy buzzed with preparation as they arrived. Clara Henshaw, now head of the civics department and Elizabeth's trusted deputy, rushed to greet them. "The Native American delegation is here," Clara reported excitedly. "Chief Standing Bear brought his entire council. They're proposing a permanent cultural exchange program." Elizabeth smiled, remembering early resistance to including indigenous students. Now the Academy's multicultural approach drew national attention as a model for inclusive education. The ceremony began at noon in the Grand Hall, its walls adorned with student artwork and academic achievements. Elizabeth took her place at the podium, surveying an audience that represented every segment of society: ranchers beside professors, territorial officials alongside tribal leaders, former students now successful professionals. 10 years ago, she began, her voice strong and clear, I arrived in Willow Springs as a rejected mail-order bride, deemed unsuitable because of my past. Today, I stand before you as an educator, a mother, a community leader, not despite my past, but because of it. Applause rippled through the hall. Elizabeth continued, outlining the Academy's growth from a converted mercantile to a campus serving 300 students annually. She spoke of innovations in curriculum, the scholarship program for disadvantaged youth, the teacher training institute that had become a territorial model. But our greatest achievement, she emphasized, isn't measured in buildings or enrollment numbers. It's measured in lives transformed, in barriers broken, in minds open to possibility. As if on cue, a group of former students took the stage. A Cheyenne woman now practicing law, a ranch hand's son attending engineering school, Clara's daughter preparing for university. Each shared how the Academy had changed their trajectory. The Federal delegation presented Elizabeth with a commendation for innovative education. The territorial governor announced funding for a new science wing. Chief Standing Bear gifted a ceremonial blanket, recognizing Elizabeth as a bridge builder between peoples. During the reception, Elizabeth moved through crowds of well-wishers, accepting congratulations, while deflecting credit to her staff and supporters. She paused when a familiar figure approached. Catherine Mills, the Boston journalist whose article had first brought national attention. "Mrs. Carson," Catherine smiled, "or should I say Professor Carson now? I'm here to write a follow-up piece. 10 years later, how a rejected bride built an educational empire." Elizabeth winced at the dramatic title. Hardly an empire, just a school that believes in second chances. "Much more than that," Catherine insisted. "You've created a template for progressive education that's being studied from Boston to San Francisco. The integration of practical and classical learning, the emphasis on women's education, the cultural inclusivity, it's revolutionary." As they talked, Elizabeth noticed Matthew across the room, deep in conversation with a group of ranchers about the Academy's agricultural program. He caught her eye and winked, their private signal of shared amusement at formal occasions. "Your husband seems quite the progressive himself," Catherine observed, "supporting your career so fully in an era when most men expect wives to remain domestic." "Matthew understands that supporting dreams strengthens rather than threatens a marriage," Elizabeth replied. "We've built our life on mutual respect and shared purpose." The celebration continued into evening with performances by student musicians, dramatic readings, and James's art exhibition. As twilight painted the sky in amber and rose, Elizabeth stepped onto the Academy's balcony for a moment of quiet reflection. The view encompassed both the expanded town and the distant ranch. Two worlds she'd successfully bridged. In the Academy's garden below, Margaret's irises bloomed alongside plants from diverse traditions, a living metaphor for the harmony they'd created. "Hiding from your admirers?" Matthew's voice came softly as he joined her. "Contemplating miracles," Elizabeth replied, leaning into his familiar warmth. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is our life." "Which part? The nationally recognized academy, our remarkable children, the impact you've had on countless lives?" "All of it. But mostly," Elizabeth turned to face him, "mostly I marvel at how rejection led to redemption, how a closed door opened pathways I never imagined." Matthew drew her close. "You took pain and alchemized it into purpose. That's not luck, that's character." Their quiet moment was interrupted by young voices. Hope and Faith bounded onto the balcony, ribbons flying from their braids. "Mama, Papa, James says we can each choose a painting for our room." "And Robert wants to show you his spelling test," Faith added. "He got every word right." Elizabeth knelt to embrace her daughters, marveling as always at these unexpected blessings. After believing motherhood lost to her, she'd become mother to 5, 2 by love, 3 by birth. "We'll be right there," she promised. "Give us just a moment more." As the girls scampered away, Elizabeth and Matthew shared a look of profound gratitude. Their family, like their community, had grown in ways neither could have predicted that day on Willow Springs Main Street. The evening concluded with a lantern procession from the Academy to the town square, where a new statue was unveiled. A bronze figure of a woman with books in one hand and a lamp in the other, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The plaque read, "Elizabeth Walker Carson, educator and visionary. From rejection to redemption, lighting the way forward." "I still say it's too much," Elizabeth murmured to Matthew as admirers photographed the monument. "It's exactly right," he countered. "Future generations should know that one woman's courage can transform a community." Later, as the family gathered in the ranch's parlor, Elizabeth opened a special gift from her children, a leather-bound book containing letters from former students describing how the academy had shaped their lives. Sarah had compiled it secretly over months. "Read the last entry," Sarah urged, her eyes suspiciously bright. Elizabeth turned to the final page, finding a letter in Matthew's distinctive hand. "My dearest Elizabeth, 10 years ago, I offered shelter to a woman the world had rejected. I thought I was being charitable. Instead, I received the greatest gift of my life. You didn't just heal our family, you showed us that hearts can expand infinitely, that love multiplies rather than divides. Watching you transform pain into purpose, rejection into revolution, has been the privilege of my lifetime. Our children, our community, and countless lives bear the imprint of your courage. Thank you for choosing to stay, to build, to love. Forever yours, Matthew." Tears blurred Elizabeth's vision as she looked around at her family. Sarah preparing for medical practice, James with his artistic dreams, the twins full of unlimited potential, young Robert already showing his father's steady strength and his mother's quick mind. "You've given us more than an education," Sarah said softly. "You've shown us how to turn adversity into advantage, how to see possibility where others see only problems." That night, after the children were asleep and the house had settled into peaceful quiet, Elizabeth and Matthew sat on their porch swing as they had countless evenings before. The lights of Willow Springs twinkled in the distance, the academy standing proudly among them. "Any regrets?" Matthew asked, echoing his question from years ago. Elizabeth considered the journey, from rejected bride to respected educator, from childless widow to mother of 5, from outsider to community pillar. She thought of the thousands of students whose lives had been touched, the barriers broken, the precedents set. "Not one," she replied firmly. "Every step, even the painful ones, led us here. Above them, stars wheeled in their eternal dance, bearing witness to the truth that Elizabeth Carson had embodied, that rejection can become redirection, that second chances can yield first-rate lives, and that love, when given room to grow, can transform not just individuals, but entire communities." As the night deepened, Elizabeth made a final entry in her journal. "Tomorrow, the delegation returns to Washington with plans to implement our educational model nationwide. What began with one woman's humiliation has become a movement for dignity, inclusion, and opportunity. Perhaps this is the deepest truth I've learned, that our greatest wounds, properly tended, become our most powerful gifts to the world. I came west seeking a new beginning. I found instead a new definition of what beginnings can be. Not erasures of the past, but integrations of all we've been into, all we might become. My name is Elizabeth Walker Carson. I was once rejected for being previously married. That rejection became my liberation, leading me to a love deeper than I'd imagined, a purpose greater than I'd dreamed, and a legacy that will outlive us all. In the end, we are not defined by those who reject us, but by what we choose to build from the rubble of our broken plans. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.